Welcome to episode 2 of Epitaph East Anglia, the podcast from Norma Explores. This week we're in Cambridgeshire and we are in the village of Burwell. I have to include a trigger warning with this week's episode. It's going to be fairly horrific and it does concern the mass burial of a number of children who sadly died in a fire. So if that's going to be something that you find upsetting, perhaps consider where and when you listen to this episode. Before we head to the village churchyard and this week's burial, we're going to visit the scene of this incident. If we take a walk through the village just off the main thoroughfare, we come to a footpath called Cuckold's Row, which undoubtedly has its own story behind it somewhere. But you will now find on the side of a modern wall a blue plaque which tells the beginning of this tale. It reads, "Near this spot stood the barn where 78 people, 51 children and 27 adults, died in a fire during a puppet show on the 8th of September 1727. The barn that stood on the corner here had been rented out to the performers to put on their show, and it was a much anticipated event. On the night in question, far more people turned out to watch than had been expected, and soon the barn was at risk of being dangerously overcrowded. When the barn was deemed at capacity, with around 140 people inside, it was decided that a nail be hammered through the door into the frame to prevent any further access to those still turning up. Tragedy struck at around 9 p.m. when a fire broke out and people began to attempt an escape. Of course, those inside didn't know that the door was barred, and the panic only increased when the space began to fill with smoke. Embers falling from the dusty rafters added to the chaotic scene. When the door was finally opened, those escaping had to climb over those who had been crushed in the panic. Some found their way into a neighbouring courtyard, only to find themselves again trapped by adjoining cottages, which were now also alight. I won't go into detail here, for the newspapers at the time were quite graphic in their descriptions of the aftermath, describing the condition of the bodies and the scene that presented itself to rescuers. They are available online though, so should you wish to delve deeper into this event, it's all out there for those wanting more. It was a truly horrific scene, and of the 140 or so people attending the show, 78 were killed. The dead, some of which who could not be separated from one another due to the severity of the heat, were buried in a mass grave, and that is where we will go now. In the churchyard of St Mary's you will find the tomb of the burning heart, a headstone marking the spot of the mass grave. This is a story that I've known most of my life. I remember coming to visit this grave with my grandfather, which possibly goes some way to explaining why I am the way I am now. But even as a child at school, we were told about this local piece of folklore, and it wasn't until much later that I read into it and discovered quite what a horrific story it was. The Ipswich Journal reported, "The dead bodies taken out of the barn were carried in carts and put into a hole in the churchyard. There was among them several young women of considerable fortunes, and Mr. James Brinley, a wholesale turner, and Elizabeth his wife, who had been married but that morning." In a remarkable instance of failing to read the room, the Reverend Edmondson preached a sermon the following Sunday, asserting that it was God's vengeance that had burnt the townspeople as punishment for their sins. He boldly preached, "Their visage is blacker than coal. They are not known in the streets. Their skin cleaveth to their bones. It is withered. It is become dry like a stick." I'm reasonably certain that that sermon didn't go any way to comforting those in the village who had been affected by this event, and at that time it would have affected everybody. It's one of those events that is so rare and devastating that you would have almost certainly been related to or known someone who had been lost in the fire, and there were people that came from villages all around, so it had a very widespread effect on the local population. But it is here we come back to the story of the fire, because fires don't just start. So what happened? Well, here we meet an ostler named Richard Whittaker. He worked for the farmer who owned the barn. As an employee, he reasoned that he should get in for free, but the puppet master disagreed. Not willing to just pay the man and enter like any other decent folk, he decided to sneak in and watch from above. You see, knowing the building very well, he was aware of a neighbouring hayloft where he could climb into the rafters and perch in the roof space above. A kind version of the tale was that he slipped and his lantern accidentally ignited the dry debris up in the roof beams. In panic, he fled the way he had come in and made his escape. However it came about, he was deemed responsible for the fire and the deaths of those caught up in it. He was soon caught and taken to Cambridge Castle and held for trial. A witness was found who attested that Whittaker had threatened to take revenge on the puppeteer for not allowing him entry, though there was not much else in the way of evidence. At the Cambridge Assizes, however, he was acquitted of the crime. Nothing much more was made of the event. Families grieved and village life continued. That was until almost 50 years later. It was then that the Ipswich Journal printed this. It is reported that an old man died lately in Newmarket, who, just before his death, confessed that he set fire to the barn at Burwell in this county on the 8th of September 1727, when no less than 80 persons lost their lives, and that his having an antipathy to the puppet show man was the cause of him committing that action. So, yeah, Richard Whittaker, the mass murderer you never heard of. The headstone marking the grave carries a carving of a burning heart on one side and an inscription on the other. It used to be bright white, but now boasts lichens, and the writing is hard to read. The inscription reads, "To the memory of the 78 people who were burned to death in a barn at Burwell on September the 8th, 1727. This stone was cleaned and this inscription engraved September 1910. Burwell is a wonderful village to visit if you like history. There's an awful lot of interesting things to find there, from the site of the castle. There was a site of a priory there. You've got all sorts of really wonderful headstones in the church and the cemetery. I have done a guided tour for Burwell, and I did do a article on it on one of the early Norma Explores magazines. So if you're interested in visiting the village, there's some resources out there for you. If you visit our website at normaexplores.com, you can find links to some of the places that I've previously discussed, both Burwell and the Tomb of the Burning Heart. If you're not familiar with Guidel, it's an audio tours app where you can purchase different walking tours from all sorts of different people. And I have done a Burwell tour, which takes in some of the most interesting parts of village history. But there's still actually things in there which I didn't cover. So it's a lovely place if you've got an afternoon to explore. Next time I will be trying to visit a different part of East Anglia. I'm going to work my way around the eastern counties so that it's not just sites which are local to me here in Norfolk, so I will be covering Suffolk and Essex as well. The script for this episode is uploaded to the Norma Explores Substack should you want to have a read. Occasionally I do edit bits out which will still be in the script. I've also included some photos there for you to look at. I tend to only talk about places I visited in person, so all the photos are my own, unless obviously they are historical. I like to do my research in person, so I don't tend to do episodes and articles based on places that I've not actually visited myself, and that is sort of one of the reasons that I have chosen to focus on East Anglia, simply because I don't get to go further afield now while I have a business to run. If you use Instagram, Threads or Blue Sky, you can find us under Norma Explores, and for Instagram and Threads we also have a separate feed just for Epitaph East Anglia for those that aren't interested in the rest of the project. Either way, come and find us via our website normaexplores.com, and you can find all the links there. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.